A distant siren broke the stillness of a quiet afternoon, its wail threading through the hum of neighborhood life and stirring a gentle unease in the air. It was the sort of sound that made people pause, a lonely, urgent reminder of someone in need. At the station, Ethan slipped into his turnout gear before the call even finished coming through. He'd learned not to let his mind race ahead, but it was impossible not to wonder. The day had begun, with the sun glancing off tidy lawns and picket fences. Now, as the engine roared to life, each passing street blurred, like a memory rewritten by speed. Inside the cab, men spoke with clipped efficiency, bracing for fire and chaos. But for Ethan, there was always a hollow space between the adrenaline and the unknown, a place heavy with the silent hopes of every person waiting on help. The car fire was already raging by the time the crew arrived, its orange heat painting the evening in wild flickering light. Ethan caught a glimpse of the vehicle, a battered sedan, smoke curling out like warning signals. He moved closer, squinting through the haze, and saw her, a woman inside, chained to the seat, her arms pulled tight, her face caught between hope and resignation. For a moment he stood suspended, heart pounding so loudly it seemed to drown the fire's roar. There was an urgency to the scene, yes, but also a kind of stillness, as if the world had stopped to listen. Shouting instructions, Ethan smashed the window, the sound sharp against the crackle of flames. He met her gaze, dark eyes, wide with silent desperation, and felt the whole story of her fear pouring through that one look. The chains were cold and cruel, biting into her skin. He worked with steady hands, tools clanking, sweat stinging his eyes, every second stretching into something monumental. Around him, the engine hissed, fire twisting and reaching, but he didn't look away from her, not even for a breath, caught in the fragile moment where courage and kindness are all that stand between a life lost and a life saved. Smoke curled like gray silk through the air, making every breath a shallow, careful thing. It hugged Ethan's skin, clinging to the inside of his mouth, stinging his eyes behind the visor as he leaned closer to the car. The orange flames painted wild patterns on the asphalt, the light sharp and flickering, stretching their shadows across the battered frame of the sedan. The world had narrowed to this moment. The roar of the fire, the whir of tools, and the soft, desperate sound of the woman's breathing, ragged and uneven. Every detail pressed on Ethan, the scorched smell of metal, the dance of heat waves against his arms. His gloved hands worked methodically, but softly, careful not to make the chains cut deeper. The woman's eyes met his again and again, pulling him into her fear without a single word spoken. Between them, the night air rippled with silent questions. How had she ended up here? Would she trust him when all she could do was hope? The seconds seemed to stretch, marked by each spark drifting lazily upward and the distant, urgent mutter of the engine behind them. Red lights spun across the lot, tossing color onto Ethan's soot-dark gear and catching in the sheen of sweat on his jaw. The woman flinched as he tried the chain again, her eyelids flickering with the reflected blaze outside the window. Yet her hands, though trembling, stayed still enough for him to keep working. Time thinned around them. It was just his breathing, the metallic click of the bolt cutter, and the crackle of something precious hanging in balance. When the chain finally gave way, Ethan felt the tension leave her body like a breath she'd held for too long. He found her hand, small and icy within his glove, and guided her carefully, gently, away from the now heaving wreckage. Together they stepped from the smoke-swirled chaos into the softer glow beyond the flames. The air out here was clean but trembling, filled with the echo of terror, and, beneath it, the faintest promise of safety. A fragile, beating hope, born in the orange light and carried forward by the quiet strength of two strangers, briefly tethered. From the far edge of the lot, the chaos looked unreal, like moments from someone else's life, painted in flickering orange and red. Lights spun across blank windows, shadows darted and retreated between the maple trees, and the outline of the burning car shifted behind the haze, its shape distorted by heat. The silhouettes of firefighters moved in and out of view, sometimes clear and sharp, sometimes swallowed by smoke. In the distance, neighbors formed quiet clusters at the end of driveways, their faces caught in half-light and worry. No one spoke above a whisper. The night was full of unsettled movement. Fire hoses snaked across concrete, water misted the air, and radios crackled with clipped voices. The only thing steady was the arc of the fire engine's headlights, tracing the low shapes of houses and gardens, as if to measure the quiet against the storm. Within that mosaic of light and shadow, Ethan and the rescued woman moved carefully, not quite belonging to the chaos behind them, nor to the safety in front. Their forms, one broad and solid, the other slight and uncertain, were drawn together by necessity, but from a distance they might have seemed like two figures in a memory, separated by smoke, joined by fate. A paramedic lifted a flashlight, its beam momentarily illuminating the woman's dust-streaked face and Ethan's tired eyes before passing on to check the rest of the crew. For a moment, it all faded to a collection of impressions, a trembling hand reaching for security, shoulders squared against the cold, the way the ruined car reflected shards of emergency light on the damp, uneven pavement. The sounds, too, became softer from here. More suggestion than statement, more breath than voice. In the hush that followed, it was as if the world itself paused to exhale, letting the flames settle and the adrenaline seep away, leaving only the certainty that something meaningful had happened. Fragile, resilient, and just visible at the edge of ordinary sight. Time seemed to slow as Ethan guided the woman toward the open air, each movement heavy with meaning. His gloved hand, usually steady and sure, trembled just a little as he supported her, aware of the thinness of her wrist and the chill that clung to her skin. Her breaths came shallow and soft, ribs fluttering with fear and relief, like a sigh never fully exhaled. The world beyond the chaos felt muffled, just the muted beat of his heart and the rasp of breath between them. Each step was cautious, as if a single misstep could shatter the fragile moment. The heat of the fire still prickled against his back, but he was attuned only to the small, deliberate acts, adjusting his grip so the rough gloves wouldn't hurt her, watching how her fingers curled tightly around his arm, her knuckles pale from strain. The memory of chains left bruises beneath her sleeve, and Ethan felt a quiet resolve grow inside him to carry her through whatever came next, if only for the sake of this shared, trembling now. They paused by a low curb, where the noise of the engine softened and the ambulance's interior glow spilled into the night. The woman's hair was a tangled shadow over her face, strands shaking with each uncertain breath. Ethan lowered himself to her level, nerves buzzing through his arms, and searched her eyes, wide, almost distant, as if she were somewhere between leaving and arriving, caught in the hush that follows disaster. The chilly air drew goosebumps on her arms, and her lips parted in a silent effort to catch her bearings. Around them, everything else faded, the wailing sirens, the shouts, the spinning lights. There was just the hum of their breathing, a trembling closeness where care and presence meant more than any words. Ethan whispered, soft reassurances meant not to fix, but simply to keep her tethered. In those slow-motion sensations, the thrum of blood in their ears, hands hesitant and protective, the uncertain grounding of feet on cool asphalt, they both found a kind of fragile safety that felt timeless, like the world itself had leaned in to witness and would remember. The ambulance door stood open, a space of calm amid the pulsing lights, but the woman's eyes never stopped searching Ethan's face. She held his sleeve for a moment, her grip tight, and the question hovered in the air between them. Would he have to leave her side and return to the danger burning just steps away? She knew he might not return. Firefighters moved quickly around the scene, following the dance of orders and routine, but Ethan stayed kneeling beside her longer than he should, weighed down by her silent plea. Her world had tilted, and he was the one anchor she had found in all the confusion. Her mind clung to his presence, memorizing details, the rough edge of his glove, the steady set of his jaw, the fleeting warmth in his careful eyes. She wanted to thank him, to hold him there a moment longer, but her voice pressed tight in her throat, caught by both fear and gratitude. He sensed her silent desperation, the raw edge of urgency before the world shifts again. Duty called to him, the same way it called every firefighter back to the fire, but he hesitated, searching her face for a sign that she would be all right on her own. There, in that brief pause, he offered a promise with his gaze, that he would do all he could to return, to be a steady presence amid her chaos. The moment was both endless and fleeting, slow with emotion, yet charged with the reality that it could end at any second. Around them, radios crackled, boots pounded, shouts echoed, and still he lingered, one last heartbeat shared. When finally, he rose and turned away, she watched him go with hope and fear in equal measure, holding on to the memory of his hand, his care, a tangible reminder that, even in the worst of nights, Sometimes strangers appear just long enough to pull us back from the edge, even if only for a little while. Earlier that day, before the sirens and the fire, the house was still and warm. The gentle hiss of water boiling on the stove filled the kitchen, and the woman moved quietly, her hands steady as she measured loose tea leaves into a faded blue cup. Outside, the rain tapped steadily at the windows and the roof, a soft percussive rhythm that settled her nerves and slowed her thoughts. Light leaked in, silver and cool, bouncing off the edges of the oak table and painting gentle shadows across the floor. She leaned for a moment against the counter, watching the steam rise, imagining the rest of the world held at bay by the simple, humble rituals of her morning. For these few quiet minutes, there was only the soft shuffle of slippers, the comforting scratch of a spoon in a cup, and the steady comfort of the rain. Each sound a reminder that, here and now, she was safe, cocooned from the wildness that sometimes prowled outside. The living room, too, breathed peace. Her chair near the window was draped with a knitted blanket, a book face down on the armrest, and a candle flickering steadily in the corner. She sipped her tea and watched the street, where drops slid in slow columns down glass and passing cars left halos in puddles. Her mind traveled quietly, tracing memories and small hopes, skimming over worries that felt distant in the hush of rainy morning. She could remember the feeling of belonging, gentle visits, laughter around old tables, hands held for comfort. But the house was quiet now, each tick of the clock echoing in the pause between thunder and stillness. In that small world of warmth and ritual, she found herself wishing, without words, for connection, a sign or a kindness, even fleeting, never imagining that by nightfall she would wish only to return, to hear the rain in the kettle once more, to feel again the ordinary safety that she had always taken for granted. Back at the scene, Ethan returns to the fire, his boots ringing with water and grit. The other firefighters fell in step beside him, moving with a rhythm set by both practice and trust. As they regrouped near the engine, Brian nudged him gently and offered a quiet joke about Ethan's uncanny knack for finding trouble, his grin tired but genuine beneath the smear of soot. The others chuckled, just a soft ripple of laughter, more a release than a celebration. For a moment, the heavy weight of urgency eased, replaced by the familiar comfort of shared work, and the unspoken acknowledgement that each man and woman there carried their own small fears. Under the strobing lights and the haze, they didn't need to say how close the night had come to unraveling. Their camaraderie lived in the casual way they offered water bottles, the careful clapping of hands on shoulders, the wordless vows they made with simple gestures, a nod, a checked gauge, a second glance to be sure no one was missing. The firefight wound down with practiced efficiency, and soon the roar faded to the hum of cooling equipment. Ethan stood with his crew in the edge of the headlights, where their faces were half in shadow and half in the bright, temporary day. They shared a long silence broken only by radios squawking in the background, and the faint hiss of hoses winding down. In that pause, an older firefighter named Maria caught Ethan's eye, her look full of quiet pride and concern. A simple nod passed between them, gratitude and understanding, in a gesture that meant more than words could carry. Uniformed, sooty, weary, they accepted the silence as both rest and renewal. In that company, battered by fire and resilience, they found something close to belonging. Without fuss or flourish, they gathered themselves, collected stray equipment, and prepared for the slow, reflective ride back to the station, each man and woman comforted for a heartbeat by the subtle gift of being together, inseparable in effort, stitched together by trust. As the truck rolled through the quiet streets, Ethan watched the city lights flicker past the fogged window. The engine thrummed beneath them, steady and soothing, a sound he had come to rely on in the empty hours after a call. He sat back, helmet resting on his knee, and let the voices of his crew drift around him, low, worn, and kind. The rhythm of tired jokes and the rustle of turnout coats calmed him, but his mind wandered to a secret weight in his pocket, a small, folded note he hadn't thrown away yet. It was from some weeks back, a thank you scribbled in uncertain script by a woman they'd helped, someone else, another night, another aftermath. He could never quite bring himself to toss these scraps. Instead, he carried them, worn and creased, letting them brush against his hand when the doubts crept in, when the question of whether it all mattered edged too close for comfort. Tonight, the urge to reach for the note was strong. He pressed his palm against it, feeling the edges through the thick cloth of his gear, and remembered the woman's hand clinging to his sleeve, the fever-bright fear in her eyes as she watched him disappear back into the fire. That silent plea and wordless gratitude lingered with him more than any siren or alarm bell. He knew most nights blurred together, marked by tasks and exhaustion, but these small, private relics reminded him that what he did left echoes, steady, meaningful, sometimes invisible, but real. Outside, rain pinged softly on the roof of the truck, gentle and insistent. Ethan exhaled, closed his eyes for a moment, and let himself hope that the next day would be quieter, that the people they helped would find comfort and return to quiet lives. All the while, the note rested against his heart, a humble proof that the smallest gestures could kindle something lasting, far beyond the glow of the fire or the silence of a long, dark ride home. Ethan's memories faded as a burst of static from the radio cut through the soft lull in the truck. The familiar clipped voice of dispatch filtered in, each word sharpened by urgency. Engine 32, report of vehicle fire, possible entrapment. The crew sat up straighter as the information sank in, boots shifting on rubber mats, hands tightening reflexively around straps and gear. Ethan felt the subtle change in the air, a hush filled with old fears and practiced calm. He glanced at Brian, who lifted an eyebrow in silent acknowledgement, and then at Maria, who gave the smallest nod, steady as ever. Instincts took over, movements smooth and automatic, driven by the gravity in that phrase, possible entrapment. No one spoke. There was nothing to add, no bravado or reassurance, just the silent pact among them that they would all do what needed to be done, no matter what waited at the scene. The world outside blurred into streaming lights and slick streets as the truck picked up speed. Rain traced lines down the windshield, catching the pulse of red and white. The city's edges faded into a shifting landscape of shadows. Storefronts, houses, quiet intersections, all swept past with barely a glance. Ethan felt his chest tighten with anticipation, his mind already running through protocols, the what-ifs and muscle memory hardwired into every nerve. Calls like these pressed a certain gravity into his thoughts. Someone would be waiting, trapped, afraid, hoping for rescue, counting on the sound of approaching sirens. In the cab, breathing grew shallow. Time seemed to coil in on itself, and the only certainty was the promise they carried, to show up, to step into the unknown, and to do more than merely arrive. As the radio crackled again with details, the city shrank to the size of the task ahead. The engine roared. Lights flickered over the empty roads, and nothing else existed except the determination to reach someone who, in this moment, needed them more than anything in the world. In the quiet study of the truck's cab, Ethan's eyes had been soft, tracking the rhythm of raindrops as they chased each other down the glass. The city rolled by in a blur, streetlights smeared into lines of gold, and for a flicker of time, calm held its own. Gentle, reflective, familiar. For Ethan, these were the moments he found breath in. The lull between emergencies, the brief passages where yesterday's burdens faded and tomorrow's worries seemed small. His features, relaxed and thoughtful, mapped gentle concern more than action. Around him, the crew reflected the same, their banter and silence weaving a kind of measured peace. It was an interval of waiting, a necessary pause before the world tipped again toward urgency. Then the radio came alive with dispatch, and the transformation was instant. Ethan's muscles tensed beneath his gear, his gaze snapped clear, the familiar doubts and daydreams gone in a heartbeat. Calm eyes turned sharp and focused, taking in every detail of the assignment. Street, cross street, possible entrapment. The softness drained from his stance, replaced by something direct and bracing, as if a switch had been thrown and all the training and commitment inside him surged forward. Maria's steady hand found the dashboard, Brian's jaw tightened, and the laughter from minutes earlier vanished, swept away by the press of responsibility. As the engine turned corners and gained speed, Ethan sat upright, jaw set and eyes forward, his mind already picturing the fire ahead. In those charged seconds, the interior of the cab gleamed with a new purpose. Every member of the crew sat alert, hearts beating a few ticks faster, emotions channeled not into fear but into readiness. An unwavering focus to meet whatever waited at the end of the siren's wail. Inside the rolling cab, the ritual began almost without thought, steps honed by repetition, layers folded into muscle memory. Ethan slipped his hands into his gloves, thick and sturdy, pulling each finger tight until the leather gripped like a second skin. The slow, practiced squeeze settled him, familiar, grounding. Around him, the others reached for their own gear, the truck brimming with the subtle soundscape of preparation. Velcro straps whispering closed, zippers tugged secure, the dull thud of heavy boots braced against the metal floor. Maria adjusted her jacket, face half in shadow, her every movement deliberate and steady. Brian rolled his shoulders, stretching inside the bunker coat before snapping it shut, hands quick but never rushed. In this compressed world of fiberglass and vinyl, every detail mattered. Even the air felt different. Sudden, denser, filled with the shared breath of a crew lining up at the edge of danger. Ethan reached for his helmet, the familiar curve cool in his palm, and settled it over his dark hair. The muffled world sharpened as the chin strap tightened beneath his jaw. The click echoed softly in his ears, a small but essential promise of safety. He could feel his pulse ticking at his temple, but his focus never wavered. Every buckle, every snap of webbing, was a kind of shield against uncertainty, a line drawn between chaos and control. All around him, the crew did the same, their faces briefly hidden behind visors or lowered chins, breath held in a silent, collective pause. These rituals did not just protect their bodies, they organized fear and purpose, turning nerves into readiness. For a moment, time seemed to stop, as each firefighter braced for what was to come. Breath steadied, hearts anchored by resolve, everything hinged on the next call to move. And when it came, every hand was ready, every mind intent, the gear locked in place, a silent pact to carry each other forward, no matter what the fire would bring. The firehouse was a pocket of warmth, walls humming with the quiet life of soot-bright lamps and deep laughter, a place where boots dried quietly under benches and coffee lingered hot in thick mugs. The soft, enveloping air was filled with the scent of soap, leather, and the faint trace of past fires. In that protected space, Ethan and his crew moved with habitual ease, trading nods and small words, their bodies growing loose with the familiar routines. For a moment, even as dispatch's call echoed in their ears, the warmth of the station wrapped around them, granting one last, heart-deep comfort. But duty always had its own calendar. The overhead door yawned open with a groan, letting in a sharp gust of outside air as the engine's lights flickered to life. Ethan felt the abrupt shift, the soft heat of the bay replaced by the prickle of night on his skin and the metallic taste of approaching rain. The truck rolled into the darkness, slicing through the cold road like a promise made of steel and urgency. Rain smeared the windshield, headlamps painting trembling rivers along the cracked asphalt. Street after street vanished in their wake, homes glowing quietly behind curtains, untouched and unaware of what the night would bring. Inside the cab, breath plumed in the chill, and the world shrank to the narrow band of vision carved out by flashing red lights. Shadows twisted past on either side, silent trees, empty sidewalks, puddles reflecting the city's uncertain light. The warmth of the station was already a memory, packed away behind layers of fire coat and resolve. Hands gripped straps, boots braced against the floor, every heart in the cab synchronized by the steady thrum of wheels on wet pavement. Between the engine's low growl and the static from the radio, the silence deepened, a thin, fierce stillness that felt heavier than sound. They were out in the world now, bearing the cold with the heat of purpose, riding straight into the unknown future that waited, just around the next bend, in smoke and flame. Inside the truck, silence settled over the crew, thick and weighty, a pause between heartbeats. The hum of the engine, the faint rattle from equipment lockers, and the sigh of air through the vents filled the background. But the space between these sounds was where private thoughts lived. Ethan stared ahead, his eyes on the wet black ribbon of road, but his mind wandered. He remembered a phone call from his sister last week, her anxious voice asking if he was safe, and the steady comfort of the little apartment he came home to, its windows always smudged with rain. He thought, too, of the people waiting out there, strangers, every one of them, yet somehow woven into his life by these calls and sirens. With every turn of the wheels, he wondered, would tonight's rescue haunt him or bring him purpose? Around him, his fellow firefighters drifted into their own recollections. Maria, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breath and trying not to think of her grown daughter far away. Brian, eyes closed for a moment, picturing the old ball glove stowed somewhere in his garage that he'd promised to bring out for his son. Each soul held something close, regrets, small joys, mixtures of hope and worry, compartments packed neatly away for when the doors slammed open and chaos took the lead. For now, the cab was a cocoon. Every shared silence drew them together in kinship, even as their minds spun off in private directions. The city streamed past in wet streaks, the world growing distant and hushed. In the solemn, half-lit stillness, the unspoken truth was clear. Before every act of heroism, there is a quiet gathering of doubts and memories, a last longing for comfort, before the story of the night unfolds. As the city rushed by outside the truck, Ethan's mind filled with images he wished he could keep away. He pictured the fire leaping from the hood of a battered sedan, hungry and fast, licking up paint and glass and filling the small space inside with bitter, suffocating smoke. He imagined heat blooming so quickly that metal twisted and plastic sagged, the inside of the car turning harsh and bright. The worst-case scenes played out without mercy. A woman pressed against the door, hands scrabbling at locked handles, her cries muffled by smoke and panic. He saw her face in flashes, shock and disbelief giving way to a raw, silent ache as fire crawled nearer and options faded. The vision tightened his chest and sharpened his senses, forcing him to catalog obstacles he might need to overcome. If an exit was blocked, if heat warped the frame, if chains held her to the seat, time would be cruelly short. Brian and Maria sat with similar thoughts pinched across their faces, each firefighter tracing possible failures and frantic rescues in their mind's eye. Would they find the car wedged against a post, flames tracing every escape? Would the windows shatter outward or hold smoke in? What if the keys dangled, useless, just out of reach, or metal pinned limbs in place? The crew rehearsed the sequence of breaking glass, cutting restraints, hauling heavy bodies through narrow spaces, all with hands practiced, but hearts never truly immune to fear. The radio offered fragments of information, but every answered question spawned 2 new terrors. The world outside seemed to dim to those images. Fire climbing hungrily up from the undercarriage, dark smoke billowing, headlights swallowed by a churning orange gloom. Somewhere in that imagined wreck, a woman's hope flickered unsteadily. For Ethan and his crew, those worst-case visions did not paralyze. They fueled a fierce determination. If there was a way in, a chance to save her, they would find it before the smoke could write its ending. Above the noise and urgency, a quiet memory slipped into Ethan's mind, a last moment with his mother, years ago, in the golden hour just before dusk. They had met in her small kitchen, sunlight slanting through faded curtains and painting her face with warmth. She stood at the counter, stirring soup and humming softly, her hands never still even when she listened. Ethan remembered the way she set down the spoon, looked up with a familiar softness, and asked if he was eating enough, sleeping enough, if he ever took a day just for himself. He'd laughed and deflected, too proud or too restless to admit what he needed, and she'd shaken her head with a half-smile, reaching to tuck a stray hair behind his ear. The conversation wandered, memories of his childhood, hopes for his future, gentle warnings about not burning out. That was her gift, he realized later, noticing every silent hurt, finding small ways to soothe that didn't require words. As the soup simmered, she'd squeezed his shoulder and told him simply, "Come back soon, and let me know you're all right." Her kitchen had smelled of thyme and fresh bread, and that memory, so vivid now, rose up whenever he faced darkness or fear. Tonight, under the fluorescent cab lights and the distant wail of the siren, her voice echoed quietly through Ethan's anxiety. He missed the certainty of that kitchen, the way she made the world feel less sharp. There were times at scenes like this, barreling toward disaster, that he longed for just one more hour with her, one more careless evening, where emergencies were as far away as winter. That last moment together, defined by an ordinary goodbye, steadied him now, when every second felt uncertain. As he adjusted the strap on his helmet, and the road counted down to the call, Ethan kept her memory close. A silent blessing, a promise tucked inside his heart, reminding him that tenderness mattered as much as strength. The memory of his mother faded, replaced by the sharp press of adrenaline as the truck neared the call. Beyond the cab's glass, the smoke-stained sky seemed to pulse with anticipation, each rotation of the siren weaving urgency into the night. Ethan braced himself, feeling the contours of every tool at his side, eyes steady on the horizon that would soon reveal chaos. He'd learned through years on the job that you can't save everyone, can't always outrun the clock or the fire. But tonight, something fierce and silent moved through him, a quiet vow settling where fear used to live. As the map on the dash flickered and the first reflection of flame glowed on the windshield, his resolve crystallized around a simple thought. Not this time. not her. He would push back against all the uncertainty, all the failures and regrets he'd stacked up over the years, and fight for just one outcome, one life pulled whole from the flames. The city around them blurred, but inside the cab, each second carried that promise, unspoken but unbreakable. He felt the weight of his crew's trust, the invisible thread connecting their resolve, but Ethan's focus narrowed to the possibility ahead. A woman alone, trapped, afraid, waiting for the help she could not see coming. He heard her imagined voice, not in panic, but in the trembling silence of hope. Someone is coming, someone will not let go. It anchored him. As the engine slowed and the world exploded in orange and red outside, Ethan pressed his shoulder against the door, readying himself for the storm of heat and confusion beyond. The rain hammered harder, smearing firelight across the glass. He drew a deep, steadying breath, carried by the vow thrumming through his chest. He would not let go. Not tonight, no matter what waited on the other side of that uncertain, blazing dark. The fire scene came into focus softly at first, more a collection of quiet shapes than one explosion of chaos. Smoke drifted in gentle waves above the neighborhood, glowing faintly in the light of scattered street lamps. Neighbors lined the edge of their driveways, some in slippers and robes, arms folded tight across their chests, faces drawn with worry but stilled in quiet respect. There was no shouting, only an uneasy hush, the kind that falls when the extraordinary disrupts the ordinary. Porch lights blinked on, one by one, turning the wet sidewalks to bands of gold. A screen door stood half open at the nearest house, letting out a shaft of warm light onto the front step, as if the family inside could not decide whether to lock out the danger or wait for news. Here and there, the glow of phones held uncertain hands, voices murmured in the softest tones, not wanting to break whatever spell kept them safe. Beyond that circle of light and shadow, the car burned at the far end of the street, flames licking the sky, but contained to one place, as if even the fire was aware of the limits of this quiet night. The fire engine rumbled to a stop, red lights spinning silently, casting moving ribbons along the rain-slicked pavement. Ethan took in the details with a practiced eye, the battered sedan angled at the curb, smoke curling through a broken rear window, the woman's face barely visible between the orange shivers of flame. There was no manic rush, no panicked crowd, just the steady, measured urgency of response. The crew moved like practiced hands, swift, strong but never rough. Each action carried out in a hush that felt almost reverent. The rain kept falling, pattering gently against roofs and shoulders, as if trying to soothe the rawness in the air. In that quiet, with neighbors waiting in the wings and the night holding its breath, it was as though the world had gathered for one small act of rescue, a test of hope, set softly in the heart of an ordinary street. Ethan stepped from the cab into the damp hush, rain beating off his helmet and gear. The air tasted of smoke and wet asphalt, the night broken only by the muted roar of fire chewing quietly at the sedan's body. No one called out. There was no need. The crew fanned out in a quiet, seamless rhythm, scanning danger with eyes and instincts honed by years in the field. Maria circled wide to check the rear, boots splashing through puddles, her flashlight beam steady as she searched for leaking fuel or fallen wires. Brian crouched low by the curb, gauging the spread of flame, ready to shout a warning or haul a hose if one flicker strayed too close. Ethan paused just long enough to read the pattern of the fire, the way it drew breath in the broken rear window, and the way the smoke pooled, low, thick, and gray, warning of struggle inside. Their movements were both careful and decisive, no wasted steps, no uncertain gestures, every action shaped by the knowledge that speed and caution must strike a delicate balance. The team communicated in glances, nods, and the smallest shift of a shoulder or hand. Maria's eyes met Ethan's for a split second. She signaled all clear at the back. Brian traced a circle in the air with two gloved fingers, indicating fuel was contained. Another firefighter tugged gently on the front wheel, checking stability. Every assessment, every measured look, was a silent language, a series of questions and answers spoken without a sound. The rain continued its gentle tap, almost as if blessing their work, and they adjusted hoses, positioned lights, and broke glass with the low, controlled urgency of people who know how quickly crisis can unravel. Each moment was stretched thin by tension, but rooted in trust. In those practiced, intuitive movements, the team became one living thing, attentive, composed, and poised on the knife's edge between chaos and rescue. Though danger shadowed every decision, They moved as if guided by a single heartbeat, steady hands turning the night's fear into calm and hope. As Ethan and his crew closed in on the burning car, a sudden flare made the flames leap against the inside of the driver's window. For a heartbeat, the fire illuminated the interior in sharp relief. A scattering of possessions thrown across the seats, a purse melted into the dashboard, and pinned against the glass by the wind, a photograph curling in the heat. The image, a woman and a small boy beneath a summer tree, began to blacken, detail vanishing as smoke traced the edges. Ethan caught the fleeting glimpse and felt something twist inside his chest. It wasn't the fire that unsettled him, it was the echo of loss so stark and familiar that his hands hesitated on the tool. The photograph, burning quietly into ash, reminded him that memories could be erased as quickly as a flame-licked paper. He pressed forward, focused, but the jagged ache of recognition, the cost of what could be lost, stayed with him like a splinter beneath his resolve. A shift in the wind sent smoke swirling past the shattered door, curling around Ethan's helmet, thick and sweet with the scent of burning cloth and plastic. As he worked, a name seemed to rise with the heat. Soft, nearly lost in the noise, but unmistakable. He froze, just for a moment, convinced he'd heard someone whisper his mother's name, a sound woven in smoke and memory. Adrenaline prickled over his skin, and for a fraction of a second, the fire wasn't just a present threat, but a doorway through to all his old fears. He squeezed his eyes shut, steadying his breath, blocking out the imagined voice. Above the orange flicker and blaring radio, he heard only his own breathing. He shook it off. He had to, but the personal obstacle lingered, nerves jangled raw by what the fire tried to take. Names, faces, the fragile links that held their lives together. In that moment, Ethan understood that every rescue was not just against the flames, but against forgetting, against letting go of the things, and the people he still carried with him. Ethan stepped forward, boots splashing through puddles, every sense narrowed to the battered car and the glow of its fire. The world outside, the quiet neighbors, the hush of rain, the thin voices of the crew, fell away as he reached for the door. In that small span of space, where cool night air met choking heat, he crossed an invisible threshold. Inside was chaos. Smoke swirled in angry tides, heat pressed against every inch of skin, and shadows twisted wildly across the glass. Entry was not just an act of rescue, but a decision, a moment weighted with meaning. Stepping into the blaze meant leaving the safe side of life and every certainty he'd carried from the station. It was a crossing into fear so complete that his shoulders stiffened beneath the weight of what he could lose and what he might save. Yet something deeper pulled him onward. An old lesson tucked inside each memory, a promise to the boy he'd been and the mother who'd taught him gentle courage. Fear could be faced, and hope could be chosen. With the door forced open, the smoke unspooled around him, thick as ocean mist, and he reached through it, calling softly to the woman, imprisoned by chain and flame. The roar of the fire grew louder, but so did his voice, steady and kind, carrying the certainty of not just help, but hope. He knelt on the burned vinyl, hands moving with urgent care, heart thudding with a mix of terror and purpose. In those moments, every rescue was more than muscle and skill. It was a choice to believe in another's survival, to show faith when everything else in the world seemed lost. The fire raged and the night pressed in, but Ethan's presence in that smoky, scorched cabin became the smallest, brightest defiance, a quiet signal that someone would always step into danger for a stranger. By crossing into fear, he offered both of them something that could last, the possibility, just for this night, that hope would prove stronger than fire. Inside the car, the world shrank and sharpened, its edges defined by sensation more than sight. Smoke pressed against Ethan's face mask, thick and hot, choking the lungs even with filtered air. It churned in whirls, swirling around the battered seats, and piling up against the corners of the windshield, turning every breath into a struggle. The sharp, chemical smell of burning plastic mixed with scorched fabric, thickening the air to the point that it stung the eyes and made every movement feel heavier. Sparks sputtered along the dashboard, hissing in the swollen orange half-light. Beneath every sound, the soft groan of metal could be heard, a warning that the car itself was warping in the heat, that their time inside would be measured in heartbeats. The floor trembled beneath his boots, resin warping and glue melting, the familiar world outside reduced to a muffled memory on the other side of the glass. A rhythmic creak echoed above the crackle of flames, an awful living sound that swept through the cabin, reminding Ethan that the beams and supports in even the smallest machine have their breaking point. The metal frame ticked and flexed, groaning louder each time he shifted weight, as if complaining about every extra moment spent inside this growing furnace. Heat flowed up from the seat, burning through every layer of his protective clothing, while the shadows thrown by the fire danced wildly across the interior, painting everything with haunted motion. The harsh red of warning lights flashed in the smoke, barely carving a path through the gloom, and for an instant, Ethan was aware of just how thin the line was between rescue and disaster. Every sense was on edge, every noise was sharper, every echo a possible threat. Still, within that suffocating, chaotic space, he focused only on the task. The metallic rattle of chains, the slight weight of the woman's trembling hand, the urgent promise that this moment, however harsh and raw, would be survived. Ethan drew in the searing air through his mask, counting each breath in the chaos so his hands would not shake. The world in the car was fire and noise, a furnace of orange and shadow. But deep inside, he called on years of training, letting instinct pilot his actions, even as his pulse hammered hard and wild against his ribs. Each step was measured. One hand checked the chains, the other felt for the release, his motions all sharp and certain, though his mind flashed warnings and what-ifs with every beat. He forced his focus to settle on what was real, the rattle of the metal, the trembling shape of the woman's shoulders, the path his tools had practiced 100 times. Emotion pressed at the edge, the fear that something would go wrong or he might be too late. But breath by breath, Ethan steadied himself, drawing a calm line between what he felt and what he needed to do. He made himself into something still, even as the fire roared to pull him under. The woman's panic was a presence in the smoke, a quickness in her breathing that made Ethan want to reach for her hand and promise safety, to whisper that they would escape together. Instead, he nodded once, assurance wordlessly given, a tremor of hope bridging the distance between them. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, fear and trust mingled in that brief gaze. He kept his voice low and gentle, saying her name softly, grounding her in the moment while his hands worked with urgency. The dance between his racing heart and careful composure was the truest part of rescue, balancing what he knew could be lost with the stubborn courage to believe they would win this time. Chains clinked, flames creaked above, and the clock pressed on, but Ethan never surrendered to panic. Calm breath, quick mind, steady hands. These were the anchors he offered, to both himself and the frightened woman, in a world that burned just outside their fragile circle of hope. Ethan's gear clung to him like a sodden weight, every layer soaked through from the rain outside and sweat inside. Water dripped down his back beneath the bunker coat, turning movements into exhausting labor, each shift and twist an effort against the gear's stubborn grip. As he leaned further into the car, the steam from the fire mixed with the damp inside his helmet, blurring his vision and leaving the world in smears of orange and gray. His mask felt tighter across his face, compressing his jaw, and every muscle strained as he reached deeper to cut the woman free. The air was so thick and hot that it burned his lungs, even through the filter, making each breath a measured act of will. He could feel the ache in his arms and shoulders, sweat and heat stiffening his movements, but there was no letting up now, not when hope sat chained just beyond his reach. The woman's chains finally gave with a jolt, but her body was slack from shock and smoke, and lifting her was no easy victory. Ethan slid his arms under her, muscles protesting as he pulled her up, her weight doubled by the limp drag of fear and exhaustion. Step by step, he backed from the burning frame, boots sinking into soaked carpet, every motion slowed by resistance. His body screamed for oxygen, chest heaving as if air might never be enough. The fire behind them raged hungrily, licking at his heels with waves of punishing heat. Sweat poured down his neck, trickling under his collar, the drag of his coat, and the heaviness in every limb turning a few short yards into a mountain of effort. But Ethan kept moving, heart pounding, pace steady and relentless, intent on mastering the pain and the limits of his own strength. Each step forward was a testament, against the fire, against his body's exhaustion, that he would carry them both out, no matter the cost. In the heat and chaos, Ethan could finally see her clearly, a young woman, fragile and trembling, her entire frame curled protectively against the seat. Wisps of dark hair clung to her face, damp with sweat and smoke, while streaks of soot traced her cheeks and jaw. Her eyes, wide and frightened, searched the smoke like a trapped animal. Between every breath, she coughed softly, the sound barely more than a whisper against the hungry noise of the fire. In her hands, clasped close to her heart, despite the awkwardness of the chains, she gripped a small silver locket. It glimmered in the sickly orange light, swinging gently with every trembling movement. Ethan watched her knuckles whiten as she clung to it, a talisman against everything threatening to take her away. He recognized in that gesture an elemental need to hold on to something pure, something that meant she was more than just a victim in the dark. She met Ethan's gaze as he worked to release her, and all her vulnerability was reflected in her eyes, large, glassy, pleading for help, for reassurance, for anything that might soften the terror closing in around her. There was so much she could not say, every word choked down by the smoke and panic, but the way she fixed on his face spoke everything. She was not only desperate for rescue, she was desperate to be seen, to be believed that this moment would not define her, that she was worth the courage and effort it took to save her. Ethan caught her glance, nodded softly, and kept his expression calm and gentle, promising silently that he would not let her go. Even as her hands shook and her breath came ragged and thin, she refused to let go of the locket, a tiny, beautiful stubbornness in the heart of disaster. That simple act anchored them both, the metal cool and real in the fire's relentless heat, a last thread of hope when so much had already burned away. The inside of the car grew smaller by the second, smoke thickening into long, heavy cords that wrapped around Ethan's helmet and filled every inch of air. The orange light from the flames became sharper, meaner, bleeding through the windows and marking lines across seats and skin. A sudden crack sounded from overhead, the car's roof, weakened by heat, shifting and groaning as beams warped under the force of the fire. Ethan felt the car shudder down to its frame, a low, ominous warning that time had nearly run out. Sparks rained down from above, stinging against his gear and skittering across the floor, where puddles of melted plastic pooled at his feet. Instinct screamed at him to move faster, to cut the remaining chain, to lift the woman clear before the structure surrendered to the heat. Panic scratched at the edge of reason as the smoke became almost too thick to see through, the air itself tightening around both rescuer and rescued. Ethan's lungs ached for true oxygen, but the woman's shallow breaths worried him more, short and desperate, as if she was already half slipping into darkness. He felt the pressure of the world outside, the urgency in his teammates' movements, the pounding of boots, the sharp voices guiding hoses and axes just beyond the roiling, burning chamber. Another sharp snap echoed above, and a chunk of the ceiling liner drooped down, embers flaring along its edge. There was no more room for doubt or hesitation. Ethan willed his body into action, summoning every last reserve. One final, wrenching pull on the chain, and then she was free. With all the force he had left, he gathered her in his arms, shielding her with the last barriers of his own body. There was no time left for anything but escape, the world behind them already starting to collapse as promise and urgency merged into one frantic bid for daylight and safety. Flames clawed at the edge of the shattered door as Ethan hesitated, the woman finally loose in his arms, but the way out collapsing fast. Outside, he could hear his team, urgent calls cutting through the roar, the rough thud of axes, and the hiss of water against fire, but all of it sounded far away, muffled by the deafening choice before him. The ceiling over the back seat bowed low, a seam of angry heat breaking open along its length, and the acrid smoke burned so deep he could barely hold a breath. He knew escape would mean turning now, shielding her body with his own, pushing through darkness and risk, even if it meant leaving behind his own chance at safety. Yet in that razor-thin moment, something inside him refused the easy answer. He checked her pulse with trembling gloved fingers, watched her eyes flutter, and realized she hovered at the edge of consciousness. Every part of his training shouted for retreat, to preserve himself, buy another second, call for more help, but when he looked at her, clutching that locket as if it contained her last bit of strength, the answer was already waiting in his heart. He considered the door, now breathing out savage heat, and weighed what might be possible: a break through the shattered side window, a dash through the narrowest lane of flame. Ethan studied the space, drawing a map in split-second flashes: broken glass, the flicker of the seatbelt strap, a momentary gap in the fire's angry spin. In the end, the decision wasn't practical. It was human. He couldn't leave her, not when she'd already endured so much, not when he saw his own mother's gentleness and quiet hope reflected in her fragile grasp. his boots rooted against the trembling floor, and he clamped her closer, lips set with grim resolve. He would risk everything for her, even if it meant facing the fire on his knees. Ethan whispered something. Words he'd want heard if roles were reversed. Hold on. We're going together. Then, lungs burning and heart thrashing, he surged toward the only path left, trading certainty for courage in the fight for one more impossible rescue. Ethan's body moved on pure will, every muscle demanding rest, as he hoisted the woman tighter to his chest and surged for the fractured opening. The world behind was swallowed in fire, heat snapping at his heels, smoke clutching at his shoulders, the car groaning and surrendering to collapse. Each motion forward demanded that he shed the weight of doubt and fear, carried with him since the radio call, since every other rescue that tugged at memory. The moment of passage felt impossibly small, the window ringed with flame, but instinct guided him, head low, shoulders squared, shielding the trembling woman. Together they crashed through into rain-chilled air, the fire's glow exploding behind them as they tumbled out onto wet pavement. It was more than escape. It was a breaking away from night's deepest grip, a reclamation of breath and hope that the smoke had nearly taken for good. For an instant, the world outside felt new, air crisp, cold, pure against their skin, streetlights spinning in his vision. Water streamed from rooftops and trees, cool and alive where, moments before, there had been only heat and suffocation. The sounds of the night returned slowly. The steady pulse of boots on pavement, the calm calls of his crew, the distant echo of neighbors' voices in the hush after crisis. Ethan knelt beside her, rain running in silver streaks down his mask as he peeled it away and looked at the woman, her face dazed but fighting for breath, the locket still pressed to her chest. As she gulped the air with shaking relief, her eyes found his, holding gratitude and fragile, stunned joy. It felt like the world itself was inhaling again, filling the emptiness with the quiet promise of recovery. This was not just survival. It was crossing back from darkness together, the first trembling moment of rebirth, shared by two strangers who had, if only for a night, chosen hope and carried each other home. Just as Ethan lunged toward the break in the smoke, cradling the woman close, the floor beneath his boots crumbled with a groan loud enough to drown out even the fire's growl. The soft, gluey foam and metal gave way, sending his foot crashing through the melted underlay, nearly pinning him in place. For the briefest terrifying moment, his balance faltered, and his grip on the woman slipped. Panic seized them both, the sudden awareness that safety was only inches away, yet slipping from their grasp. The heat below surged upward, licking at his shin, and fear shot through his veins, sharper than any burn. The woman, delirious with smoke and terror, let out a desperate cry that sliced the thick air, her arms clutching him by sheer instinct as the flames roared closer, threatening to consume both hope and flesh with every fraction of a second lost. Ethan gasped as he yanked his foot free, gear ripped, ankle burning, and willed every ounce of strength into clutching the woman higher. He summoned his voice through lungs that felt as if they would collapse. "Help!" The shout was raw, and carried a note of something rarely heard in him. Real vulnerability, the edge of pleading. His crew outside responded in a heartbeat. He could sense their shapes in the swirling haze, hear their boots pound, and their voices echo a promise he'd always counted on. Hands darted toward him through the burning maw of the doorway, the glare of flashlights cutting paths through the chaos. Guided by those outstretched arms and faith in their shared skill, Ethan dragged himself and the woman out in one last, bruising surge. Just as the car's interior caved in behind him, metal shrieking and glass exploding, he toppled into their grasp. The world snapped back into focus. Cold air, urgent hands, and the stunned relief of knowing that, by the finest edge, they both had been caught before the dark could claim them. As Ethan fought to free himself from the sinking, burning floor, a strong beam of light cut through the thick smoke, a searchlight wielded by Maria, her voice steady and clear, even amidst the chaos. Through the widening gap in the window, Ethan saw her helmeted silhouette, arm outstretched and unwavering, reaching for him. In that split second, a silent promise passed between them, one born of countless drills and shared trust, more binding than rules or rank. Maria smashed what remained of the cracked glass with a practiced swipe of her tool, widening the space just as Ethan adjusted the woman's limp form in his grasp. Cold rain spattered his face through the window's jagged teeth, sharp relief against the relentless heat inside. With one surge of determination, Ethan hoisted the woman up, guiding her toward Maria's reaching hand, letting his own battered strength be doubled by his partner's resolve. The transition from chaos to hope was sealed in that touch, her gloved grip clamping the woman's arm as if refusing to let fate write its own unhappy ending. The crew outside quickly converged, their arms and flashlights making a corridor of safety through the darkness and noise. Ethan felt his own body sag with exhaustion as Maria braced him, her presence anchoring him just long enough to find new footing. Boots slipped on the wet curb, knees scraped through broken glass, but together they pulled the woman fully into the open air, away from the greedy edge of collapse. For a heartbeat, Maria squeezed Ethan's shoulder, silent but fierce, gratitude and relief written in her eyes above the hiss of the hoses and the drone of the storm. The escape was suddenly clear, a line pulled straight by hands that refused to let go. In that messy, rain-lit rescue, their teamwork made the difference. Not just strength or heroics, but the simple, fierce power of showing up when a life was still on the line. When the last barrier fell away and they tumbled into the open, the world shrank to a few soft, sacred sensations. The first taste of cool, unsmoked air, the slick feel of rain on skin, the tender impression of hands that would not let go. The chaos of the fire was instantly muffled behind them, replaced by the simple, precious quiet of survival. The woman sagged in Ethan's grasp, but clung tighter, as if her grip alone could anchor her to life. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, each one uncertain, then steadier as she gulped the night air. The silver chain of her locket pressed between their palms, cold and real, and proof of everything she had somehow carried through the burning dark. For a while, they just stayed there. Ethan, the woman, and Maria kneeling nearby, heads bowed, not in prayer, but in the silent awe of having crossed back over the line where disaster becomes daylight. Around them, the world recalibrated in slow motion. The crew checked and hovered, their movements careful as they wrapped a blanket around the woman and urged Ethan toward the ambulance, but no one raised their voice. Even the rain seemed quieter now, slowed by gentle streetlights and the hush of spent adrenaline. Maria squeezed Ethan's shoulder just once, a small, sure gesture that needed no translation. Ethan looked down at the woman's pale hand, gripping his, felt the tremor of relief move through both of them. Her eyes, wide and damp, met his with a gratitude too deep for words. There was nothing showy in their relief, nothing wild or victorious, just the fragile dignity of surviving together. In that quiet, hands tangled and breaths mingled, hope reclaimed its place, soft, steady and holding tight as dawn waited somewhere beyond the roofs and rain. Ethan knelt next to her in the rain, blocking out the commotion of the crew and the echo of sirens as he leaned in, searching for the smallest sign of life. For a moment, the world pressed into stillness, the slick grip of his gloves on her wrist, the faint shimmer of emergency lights on the soaked sidewalk. Then, in the delicate quiet, the truth arrived. Her chest moved, barely, with a series of shallow, rapid breaths. Each one seemed to struggle through layers of fear and exhaustion, but they came steady enough to fill Ethan with cautious hope. He watched as the rise and fall of her torso created tiny ripples in the pooled water beneath her, and realized how precious something so small could feel after the choking heat and chaos inside the car. Her hand, the knuckles still white from clutching the locket, twitched just enough to break the tension. It wasn't much, a gentle flutter at first, then a more purposeful movement, her fingers reaching to rest atop Ethan's own. He caught that gesture and held it, breath-catching as he squeezed gently, reassuring them both that they were here, together, with the worst finally behind them. Her lips parted in a shallow gasp, and for the briefest instant her eyes flickered, looking up to meet his. It was in these quiet signs, these gestures so easy to overlook, that certainty settled in. Against the bruised silence of the street, alive was not a triumph shouted to the world, but something witnessed, felt in the press of hands and the fragile rhythm of recovery. In each small motion, breath, touch, a glance, a promise was made. She had survived, and he had helped carry her back into the world that now waited, dearer than ever, just on the other side of the rain. As the adrenaline faded and relief took hold, Ethan's body betrayed just how close the edge had been. His knees finally buckled under the strain, hitting the wet pavement with a dull thud that sent a shiver up his spine. The weight of everything, the rescue, the flames, the perilous grip of fear seemed to settle all at once in every joint and muscle. Hands that had been so sure, with tools and commands, now trembled, fingers clumsy as he pulled away his gloves, the fabric clinging to skin sticky with sweat and rain. It was as if his body refused to obey the expectation of calm, now that safety was no longer something to fight for. The night air bit at his flushed face. Each shaky exhale steamed in the chill. He reached for the woman's hand, needing that anchor as much as she did, and his own knuckles were white around hers, as if letting go meant the world might collapse after all. Without warning, Ethan felt tears sting his eyes, blurring the world into streaks of color and light. He tried to bite them back, to hold steady for his team and for the woman lying beside him, but the flood was impossible to stop. Tears, mixed with the smeared soot on his cheeks, mapping tracks of exhaustion, awe, and relief across skin still burning from the ordeal. Beside him, Maria's presence pressed in gently, her arms settling around his shoulders, a silent shield against the magnitude of feeling that followed survival. Something loosened in him, a knot that had drawn tighter with every second inside that burning car, and he let the grief and gratitude move through him, without shame. For a moment, the street and the crew, the hum of the ambulance and even the rain, all faded into the background. There was only the wild, raw thrum of being alive, and the unexpected softness of tears shared in the silver-washed darkness. No one cheered when it was over. Instead, the firefighters circled Ethan and the rescued woman in a hush thick as morning, boots soaking in puddles, jackets dripping in the rain, every face caught between exhaustion and awe. The adrenaline that had spurred them into the flames had drained away, leaving the crew quiet, shoulders low, eyes rimmed in relief and haunted by vulnerability. Not a single word broke the moment, as if language would only cheapen what had just been reclaimed, not just a life, but faith in the fragile thread that binds strangers, the invisible contract to show up and hold hope against chaos. Maria pressed a hand to Ethan's back. Brian knelt at the woman's side, offering a thin, battered blanket, his own eyes dropped, heart pounding as loudly as the rain on the smoldering car behind them. Under the bruised sky and street lamp glow, they bore silent witness to everything nearly lost and only barely saved. Even the neighbors along their quiet driveway seemed to sense the gravity. No one called out thanks or applause. Instead, families watched from broken porches and behind misted glass, arms wound tight around each other, their voices hushed out of reverence. The world had tilted and righted itself in a space between one breath and the next, leaving everyone aware of its delicate balance. Within the circle of firefighters, grief and awe moved in equal measure, a silent reckoning of what it means to step inside the worst and come back still holding someone's hand. In the silence, heads bowed, not in triumph, but in humble acceptance of what had been asked and given. It was a victory that rang quiet, a kind of sorrow for what they'd risked, and a sacred honoring of the moments that proved kindness is its own kind of courage. The rain fell harder, drawing lines down every tired face, blessing the silence with a mercy none of them dared to disturb. The ride back to the station was wrapped in stillness, as if the world agreed that nothing more should be said. Inside the dimly lit cab, the crew moved with slow, measured gestures, buckling belts, stowing gear, quietly checking bruises and smudges without a word. Rain tracked across the windows, blurring the city lights that crawled by, turning them into rivers of gold and blue. Faces, usually animated with jokes or easy talk, hid in the half-shadow. Maria's profile turned toward the glass, Brian's jaw clenched in reflection, Ethan's hands resting heavily in his lap. Their eyes were unreadable, gazing at a middle distance only they could see, caught between what they had just been through and what waited in their quiet homes. In that hush, no one needed to name their fatigue or the trembling ache that followed adrenaline. The shared silence was enough, permission to bear the weight in company without having to explain. Yet their hearts carried more than weariness. Each person in the truck felt something they couldn't put into words, a fullness pressed right up against sorrow, gratitude mingling with relief. The memory of the woman's trembling hand, her faint breaths, the sound of rain on their backs, settled in their chests like stones in a gentle river. The silence wasn't empty. It brimmed with everything they felt but couldn't say, the ache of almost losing, the pride in saving, the fear that lingers after a near miss, and the stubborn hope that keeps them coming back. The world outside slipped away street by street, the echo of sirens fading into the distance. As the truck rolled on, the stillness itself became a kind of balm, a way to mark what had been survived. Heads bowed not in grief, but in the quiet, powerful wonder of people who step into darkness together and return changed, carrying with them the dignity of hard-earned grace. As the truck rumbled along rain-swept streets, Ethan's mind drifted through waves of exhaustion and muted relief, drawn again to a single, luminous memory. He saw the woman as she had been just moments after their escape, soot-streaked, breath trembling, the silver locket still pressed to her chest. In that quiet, after the fire and panic had receded, she had turned her head and truly looked at him. Her eyes, wide and dark and shining with gratitude and disbelief, fixed on his, asking without words if this was real, if she'd really survived, if kindness could break through even the worst night. That gaze had cut through the chaos and noise more sharply than any alarm or scream. Ethan found himself caught in it, an anchor dropped in the tired, storm-lit world, her silent thanks echoing deeper than any words could reach. The memory played over in Ethan's mind, each detail burnished by the heavy stillness of the ride. He remembered the quiver at the corner of her mouth, how her grip tightened around his hand, the trembling mix of hope and shock that flickered fresh with every heartbeat. He sensed in her look an unasked question, why a stranger would give everything, even risk himself, to pull her from the fire. And in that moment, as their eyes met, Ethan felt a wordless understanding bloom between them, that what matters most in all the world might be summed up in a single act of care, witnessed and received. That brief exchange lingered, echoing long past the clang of tools and the smoke-wreathed confusion, imprinting peace at the center of all the hurt. When Ethan finally let his own eyes drift shut in the cab's dim glow, he carried with him not just the fatigue of rescue, but the quiet, steady radiance of being truly seen, if only for a moment, in the eyes of someone whose faith in life had returned. Weeks slipped quietly by, the memory of that night burning softly at the edges of Ethan's everyday life. Rain continued to fall some evenings, tapping gentle rhythms on the kitchen window while he sat with tea, thinking more often of the woman with the silver locket. One night, after a late call had wrapped and the city lay settled and dark, Ethan found himself driving home along a familiar route. The streets glistened, washed clean by the same rain that once mingled with soot on his skin. Up ahead, he saw her neighborhood, the same bundle of homes where hope and disaster had once crowded together on a single curb. As he idled at the stop sign, tired hands gripping the steering wheel, he glanced to his right and saw her house lit gently against the hush of evening. Her porch light glowed in the soft, persistent drizzle, a steady beacon in a block of darkened entries. He noticed the locket hanging now from the door handle, gleaming softly in the golden lamp. Behind lace curtains, the shape of a woman moved quietly through the front room. A gesture, a flicker of a hand tidying a book or setting down a cup. There was no guarantee she saw him, or knew he was there. This moment was silent, almost secret, but Ethan felt its meaning press warm and deep into his chest. The porch light had been left on, not for a hero, not for show, but as a quiet promise kept, an ongoing signal that hope continued inside. He sat for a breath or two, watching the gentle yellow spill over brick and garden stakes, and found himself quietly grateful that she was home, safe, and surrounded by light. Then, as the rain deepened and the world grew stiller, he moved on, carrying the quiet blessing of her porch through the night, certain that, sometimes, a single act of rescue can ripple far beyond the edge of an emergency, steady as a lamp left burning against the dark. On a gray afternoon a few days later, Ethan came into the firehouse after restocking the truck to find a small white envelope resting on the kitchen table. The neat handwriting on the front carried his name, simple and unadorned. He picked it up, heart nudging a little faster as he broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter, gentle, gracious, the words spilling gratitude and relief in loops and careful lines. She thanked him for his courage, for not letting her fear be the last thing she felt in the world. The letter spoke of healing, of finding the strength to let her porch light shine again, and it ended with a promise she would someday be able to live lighter, remembering that calm hands and honest kindness changed everything that night. Folded inside was a photograph, the silver locket open, showing two faces, hers and a laughing child, caught in the sunlight that spoke of the future still waiting for both of them. That evening, as the station filled slowly with the smells of supper and the quiet chatter of a long shift's end, another surprise appeared, this time in the form of a homemade pie, still warm, wrapped in a towel with a note that simply read, "For all you gave back that night." Maria lit an old candle on the table as the crew gathered, turning the kitchen's usual glow into something gently sacred. They carved slices, passing plates with a word or a smile, and let the candle's light flicker across tired faces. No one spoke much about the night or the letter, but they all understood. Kindness returned, breaking bread together, was the true measure of the work they did. In the quiet, a sense of connection wove through the laughter and silence alike, a promise that each act of care, no matter how small, lives on in the warmth of shared pie, the glow of a candle, and the steadfast invitation to keep the lights on for one another when darkness presses near. Long after the others drifted away, after the last piece of pie had been quietly divided and the candle's glow had faded to a gentle wick, Ethan found himself alone at the firehouse table. Silence pressed in, patient and thick, brushing the walls with shadows and every small hum from the fridge or clock feeling louder than it should. He leaned forward and let his hands rest open on the cool wood, calloused palms up, catching the dance of memory in old scars and new aches. In their lines and ridges he saw everything from the night, the narrow escape, the trembling hands of the woman and her locket, the hurt and hope that had passed through his fingers and would not soon be washed away. The station around him felt at once like a shelter and a confessional. Walls built to bear the burden of stories that could never be told in full. Gratitude pulsed through him, real and deep, thankful for the letter, for the safety of the woman's home, for crew and comfort, and the rare peace of a night passed in quiet kindness. But beneath that gratitude ran a quieter current, one of doubt and weariness, that all the pie and laughter in the world could never erase. He stared at his hands, grateful and haunted, knowing they had rescued, comforted, and failed in turns, and that each life saved etched itself in ways words could never reach. The hum of the building settled with him, slow and gentle, and outside, rain began again, soft and steady, rinsing the city. Ethan gave the darkness one last, heavy look before closing his eyes and simply breathing. Holding in that breath, just for a moment, both the ache and wonder of a life lived at the thinnest, brightest edge between loss and hope. The firehouse sat quiet around Ethan, the memory of the night winding through him with each steady breath. He traced the edge of the letter beside him, feeling the weight of all it represented. Fear met with courage, loneliness interrupted by a stranger's touch. He realized that long after the locket had been found, the porch light left burning, and the pie shared in the kitchen, something within him had shifted. That rescue, the impossible choice, the trembling step into fire, the quiet handclasp in the aftermath, had created a change that lingered beyond the easing of wounds. He carried with him not only the echo of flame and fear, but also the gentle burden of having restored, not just a life, but a whole circle of hope to a woman, her child, and all those who loved her. In his solitude, gratitude and sorrow pressed together, teaching him that the true measure of his work could not always be found in the tally of saves, but in moments of reconnection, and the silent architecture of trust built in a single hardest night. There was a reason he would remember her eyes, the soft grip of her hand, and the porch light blossoming in the rain. It was clearer to him now, sitting in the hush after the storm, with his hands open and tired on the table. Some rescues save more than a life. They rekindle a sense of belonging, faith in the small kindnesses that carry people through darkness. Here, in the faint gold of dawn inching into the world, Ethan let this truth settle into his bones. Every call, every act of rescue, is an invitation to believe in lives mended and hearts reopened. His, the woman's, the families holding each other beyond splintered porches, the crew gathered in the warmth of candlelight at the end of the longest shift. In that gentle, unspoken certainty, he found himself leaning forward into another day, grateful for the rare grace of having had a hand in bringing someone, perhaps both of them, safely home. Across town, in a house that had once known only silence after sunset, the woman sat curled on her living room couch, a blanket tucked around her knees and the locket resting warm in her palm. Soft light glowed from the porch, spilling gold onto the window glass as rain whispered against the roof. In the quiet, she breathed in the gentle peace of safety. Tea cooling beside her, her child's laughter echoing down the hall, the ordinary miracle of a night at home. Sometimes, when the rain grew heavy or thunder rolled across the sky, she would startle at old memories rising up, the scent of smoke and taste of fear never quite washed away. Yet in that silence, she always found herself returning to another memory too, the determined eyes behind a smeared visor, the careful hands that found her in the dark and lifted her, awkward, frightened, but alive, into a world she once thought she'd lost. She carried the fire with her, the way survivors always do, etched in dreams and the hush between heartbeats. Embers flickered beneath the surface of her most mundane days, but they no longer dimmed the light she carried forward. The porch stayed lit, the locket still swung gently from her throat, and sometimes, late at night, she would press her hand to her chest and remember, not only the terror or the night when everything burned, but the moment, swift and gentle, that changed everything. She remembered the fire. But most of all, the knock.